Have you ever wondered what would happen if the place you stumbled upon wasn't just a cabin, but a message from God Himself? In the middle of the Montana mountains, a young boy and his loyal dog discover an abandoned house. But inside, they don't find treasure. They find words. Words written by a man who once lost everything and found peace through faith. What if this cabin wasn't built by human hands, but by something greater? A miracle meant for those who've lost their way. Stay with me to the end. This story will warm your heart, maybe even change how you see your own life. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this story, so that maybe, just maybe, it finds the next soul who needs it. Thank you, and may God bless you. The last town behind them had been Livingston, Montana, a ribbon of cracked asphalt, weathered brick storefronts with tin awnings clattering in the gusts, and a grain elevator that threw a long, chalky shadow over the rail tracks at dawn. Autumn had come down from the Gallatin Range hard and early, dragging a sky the color of old pewter and a breath of snow that stung the nose and made boots creak. Wind rattled the cottonwoods along the river until yellow leaves swarmed like startled birds, and the air carried the smell of iron and wet pine. In that blunt, breathless cold, the world seemed to shrink to the steam of one's exhalation, to the crunch of frost-sugared needles underfoot. Ethan Miller, 13, narrow-shouldered, long-legged in the way of boys who grew faster than their genes, sandy brown hair that refused to lie flat, and eyes the earnest gray-blue of glacial lakes, tugged his hood tighter. He was handsome in an unfinished way, a face that told on him when he was uncertain and lit up unabashed when he felt wonder. The kind of kid who made room for other people's stories even as he was trying to write his own. Beside him paced Rex, a purebred German shepherd of 16 months, already big through the chest and hips, coat a clean saddle of black over tan, ears pricked like two banners, and tail carried at a steady, confident line when he worked. Rex's gait told a biography of training and devotion. Quick, loping steps that checked back on Ethan every few seconds, a questioning glance that asked, "This way?" and a soft huff when the trail bent and the boy hesitated. The dog's eyes were a thoughtful amber, his muzzle still boyish but strong, his paws trackmaker big and certain on scree and root. In town, folks sometimes flinched at Rex's size, but the dog was gentle around anything smaller than himself and grave around anyone who sounded hurt. He had learned commands from a neighbor who'd once trained search and rescue, and while that neighbor was gone now, the lessons remained, coiled in muscle and memory. They had been walking since dawn, following a narrow deer path that wound upward through lodgepole pine and granite outcrop. Ethan had packed light: a canvas backpack, a thermos of cold cocoa, a half-empty bag of jerky, and a hand-me-down compass with a cracked glass face that still pointed true enough. His breath misted in the air, and when he stopped to catch it, the forest exhaled around him. Pine sap, damp soil, something older, almost solemn. He hadn't meant to stray this far. The trail had started as a shortcut from his grandparents' cabin where he was spending the autumn while his mother worked long shifts down in Bozeman. But curiosity had a way of stretching time and distance. There was something about the mountains, the way they folded over one another like sleeping giants, that made him feel both small and infinite at once. As noon burned weakly through the haze, Ethan and Rex broke through a stand of spruce and stumbled into a clearing. It was there that he saw it. A cabin, crouched low against the slope like a creature at rest. Moss draped its roof in uneven tufts. Vines clutched at the window frames, and one shutter hung askew, thudding faintly in the wind. A rusted stovepipe jutted like a broken finger from the roof. The place looked deserted for decades, yet strangely not forgotten. Ethan felt Rex stiffen beside him. The dog's ears flicked forward, nose lifted, tail low but not tucked. Ethan followed the line of Rex's gaze to the door, half open, creaking on a single hinge, as if inviting and warning all at once. He hesitated. The wind moaned through the trees, and somewhere far below, a crow called once and fell silent. "Easy, boy," Ethan murmured. His voice sounded too loud in the stillness. He stepped closer, boots whispering over leaves and damp moss. The porch boards groaned under his weight. Rex followed, each step careful, claws clicking softly. Ethan reached out and pushed the door with 2 fingers. It swung inward, releasing a puff of cold, stale air tinged with dust and something faintly metallic, perhaps old nails or forgotten tools. Inside, light leaked through gaps in the roof, turning the air into thin gold beams that swirled with drifting motes. A table leaned on 3 legs near the window. A chair had collapsed beside it. Shelves lined one wall, their contents half devoured by time. Jars clouded with mold, a tin mug, a cracked lantern. But what caught Ethan's eye was the book lying on the table. A thick leather journal, its cover darkened by age and one corner gnawed by mice. He brushed away dust with his sleeve. The initials TA were pressed faintly into the leather. When he opened it, the smell of paper and smoke rose like memory. The first page began in a steady, deliberate hand. "My name is Thomas Avery. I came here when I no longer knew who I was." Ethan read on, lips moving silently. The handwriting shifted from firm to hurried, as though emotion had steered the pen faster than thought. Thomas Avery, the journal said, had once been a carpenter from Idaho, a man in his 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that could tame wood, but not his own restlessness. After losing his wife to illness and his business soon after, he had driven north until the road ended and the forest began. There, amid silence, he had built this cabin from reclaimed timber and lived alone for 5 years. In the pages, Thomas described his transformation. Not a miracle, but a slow mending. He wrote of learning patience by watching snow melt, of making bread in an iron pot, of carving spoons that fit perfectly in his palm. He had written that solitude does not heal by removing pain, but by giving it room to breathe. At the bottom of the last written page, the ink had faded into the grain of the paper. "When I leave this place, I hope someone else will find it, not to live my life, but to begin their own. May this cabin be a way station for the lost." Ethan traced the words with a finger. For a long moment, neither he nor Rex moved. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees like a lullaby. He glanced around again, this time with different eyes. The broken chair wasn't just decay. It was a story ending in mid-sentence. The dust wasn't neglect. It was time, layered like quiet applause for survival. Ethan felt something stir inside him, a curiosity deeper than adventure. He wandered through the small space. The cabin had one main room and a loft above, reached by a ladder missing 2 rungs. Against one wall stood a narrow bed frame, its rope lattice still intact, though the mattress was long gone. A small shelf beside it held a tin box, inside which he found a stub of pencil and a folded scrap of parchment. Written in the same steady hand were just 4 words. "Leave it better. Always." Ethan smiled without realizing it. "I think we can do that," he whispered. Rex's tail brushed his leg, as if in agreement. For the next hour he explored, taking in every corner, every artifact left behind. An old pocket knife dulled with rust, a piece of fishing line wrapped around a stick, a lantern with glass unbroken though its wick had turned to dust. It was like finding a message in a bottle cast from another century. When the sun began to slide down behind the ridge, light poured through the west window and gilded the dust into slow-moving fire. Ethan sat at the table with the journal open before him. Rex curled at his feet, chin resting on crossed paws, eyelids drooping, but ears still twitching. Ethan read until the words blurred. The journal ended without goodbye. No final entry, no signature, just a blank page waiting for someone else to begin. He ran a thumb along the spine, then looked around the room one last time. Outside, mist had started to gather again, rising from the valley in pale ribbons. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, but the cabin seemed to breathe now. Quiet, alive, waiting. Ethan closed the book carefully, set it back on the table, and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Avery." Rex lifted his head, eyes glinting amber in the dusk, and let out a single low bark that echoed softly against the timbers. The boy smiled. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." They stepped out into the fog as the door swung shut behind them with a sigh, the journal safe on its table, the cabin standing patient and still, as it had for years, ready for the next soul who might need to find themselves in its silence. The fog lay heavy on the valley that next morning, a pale ocean trapped between the peaks. Ethan returned to the cabin as the sun barely pried its way through the gray. Frost dusted the grass. Each step he took snapped the quiet like thin glass. Rex, trotting at his side, exhaled small clouds of steam, his fur shining faintly with dew. The boy's breath came fast, not from cold, but from excitement, the kind that tightens the chest and makes the world ahead feel wide and full of promise. He had not slept well after finding the journal. The words of Thomas Avery had haunted him. Leave it better, always. It wasn't just advice. It sounded like a dare. Inside the cabin, light slanted in through the cracks, making the air look alive with floating dust. Ethan set down his backpack, coaxed a small fire into the stone hearth using splinters from an old chair leg, and the warmth began to uncoil the chill from his fingers. Rex circled twice and settled by the fire, sighing deeply, content. The place still smelled of smoke, pine resin, and something faintly sweet, perhaps the ghost of sap or candle wax from years past. Ethan's curiosity drew him toward the tall wooden cabinet standing against the back wall. The hinges complained when he pulled the door open, releasing a drift of dry air tinged with ink and paper. Inside were dozens of notebooks, stacked crookedly in rows, their covers varying from cracked leather to rough brown paper tied with twine. Some bore labels faded to ghosts: joinery, tanning, soap-making, herbs, foraging, winter. He pulled one out, a slim, oil-stained book, and blew off a veil of dust. The handwriting was smaller here, precise with sketches in the margins, diagrams of traps, notations about wood grain, even measurements for drying racks. It wasn't just a man's record of survival. It was a curriculum. Rex's ears twitched as the boy spoke softly to himself. It's like school, only better. He spent the rest of that morning turning pages, sometimes laughing in disbelief, sometimes whispering the words aloud. The simplicity of Thomas Avery's lessons amazed him. You don't need much, one note read. Just attention. The world teaches those who watch. Ethan copied the line on a scrap of paper and pocketed it. By noon, clouds rolled lower. Snow began to fall, not the heavy kind, but thin flakes that spun in lazy spirals. Ethan decided to stay longer. He chopped kindling outside with a hatchet left behind by Avery, the blade still sharp enough to bite cleanly through sapwood. The rhythm of the strikes echoed through the trees, steady, purposeful. Rex bounded nearby, chasing snowflakes and occasionally returning with a stick, tail wagging, asking to play. As the fire burned steady that afternoon, Ethan flipped through another journal labeled Hands and Heart. This one was different. It contained reflections, short paragraphs between practical advice. Skill is a kind of prayer, Avery had written. Each act of making is a way of saying, thank you for being alive. The line struck Ethan deeply. For the first time, he understood why someone might choose to live alone, not from loneliness, but from wanting to listen to life without interruption. Toward evening, the sound of footsteps startled him. Rex's head shot up, ears rigid, a low growl bubbling in his throat. Ethan rose quickly, heart thudding. Through the doorway appeared a woman in her late 50s, her shape half lost in the mist. She carried a basket and a walking stick carved from hickory. Her name, as Ethan would soon learn, was Margaret Hill, a resident of the lower valley. Margaret was tall and slender, wrapped in a wool coat the color of river stones, with gray hair braided beneath a knitted cap. Her face was weathered but kind, lines drawn deep by years of wind and laughter. Her eyes, pale green like lichen, studied Ethan with a mix of surprise and wariness. "Well, I'll be," she said, in a voice low and calm, touched by mountain cadence. "Didn't think anyone still came up this far. Thought this old place had gone to ghosts." Ethan hesitated, unsure whether to explain or apologize. "I found it yesterday. I didn't break anything, I swear." Margaret smiled faintly. "You'd be the first in years to care whether you did." She stepped closer, glancing at the fire. "Used to pass this cabin as a girl. My father told me a man lived here once. Quiet sort, kind eyes, but never came down to town. That must have been your Mr. Avery." The mention of the name drew Ethan's attention. "You knew him?" She shook her head. "Not well. Folks said he built this place from an abandoned line shack, spent years fixing it up. Then one day he just left. No one knew where." Her gaze softened as she noticed the open journals. "You been reading his notes?" "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said, straightening a little. "They're incredible. He wrote everything. How to cook, fix tools, build things, even thoughts about life." Margaret set down her basket. Inside were apples, wild honey, and a loaf of coarse bread. "Then he'd be glad someone's learning from it. He always believed what you make should outlive you." They spoke for nearly an hour. Margaret told him about the valley, the logging town that once stood to the south, the floods that had taken half the road, and the winters that taught people humility. She mentioned she lived in a small cabin by the river with her brother Paul, a retired miner whose lungs were half ruined from dust, but whose heart, she said, was as stubborn as granite. Ethan listened with fascination. Every word painted color into the landscape he thought he already knew. When the light dimmed, Margaret gathered her coat. "You're a brave one, coming up here alone," she said, then reached down to scratch Rex's ears. "And you've got a fine guardian. Take care of each other." She left behind the basket with a quiet insistence, consider it rent for borrowing the past, and disappeared into the fog, her silhouette swallowed by trees. As night fell, Ethan fed the fire again. He tore a piece of the bread, shared it with Rex, and opened another notebook. The flickering light made the pages glow amber. He practiced tying knots described in the margins, fumbling at first, then grinning as the loops held firm. It was simple, but it felt profound, like connecting threads between himself and someone long gone. By the time he packed to leave, stars had blinked through the mist. The journals lay spread open across the table, the fire's breath stirring their corners. Ethan took one last look around the room. The shelf, the cabinet, the journal still resting where he'd first found it. The cabin no longer seemed empty. It was a place that remembered being useful. He whispered into the quiet, "We'll come back tomorrow, Rex." The dog's ears perked. Ethan smiled, pulling the door closed behind them as the forest exhaled again, cool and deep. The mountain held its breath, watching as the boy and his dog vanished down the trail, carrying a little more knowledge and a sense of belonging with them. By the time the first real snow came to the Gallatin Range, the cabin was already half buried beneath the white. The wind moved like breath over glass, silent but sharp, smoothing every corner of the forest until it looked carved from bone. Ethan Miller had returned to the cabin earlier that month, hauling what little supplies he could manage from town: a few sacks of flour, a coil of rope, and rolls of cloth he had traded from Margaret Hill for a stack of kindling he'd split and dried. Winter had no mercy for the unprepared, and the mountain demanded respect. Ethan intended to show it. He worked from dawn until dusk those first days, sealing cracks with pine resin, patching the roof where the boards had warped, and stuffing dry moss between logs to keep out the drafts. His fingers blistered, split, and healed again, and though the cold gnawed through his gloves, there was something deeply satisfying in the rhythm of the work. Rex stayed close, his thick German shepherd coat already heavier, glistening dark gold under the brief sun. The dog was now nearing 2 years old, fully grown, with a regal strength about him and the steady patience of a seasoned companion. When Ethan worked, Rex watched. When Ethan stopped, Rex nudged him to move again. One morning, as the temperature plunged and the world outside seemed made of silence, Ethan found an old iron stove in the corner of the cabin he'd never noticed before. It was buried beneath a tarp, rust spreading across its belly like old lichen. He dragged it out, cleaned it, and repaired the cracked leg with a piece of forged iron left behind by Thomas Avery. When he struck a match that evening and watched the first orange tongue of flame catch, he felt an emotion he couldn't name, a mixture of pride, belonging, and something close to gratitude. Days turned shorter, nights longer. The valley became a place of muffled sounds and white breath. Ethan began reading through Avery's journals by firelight, entries about patience, solitude, and the strange companionship of quiet. He wrote his own notes beside them, in smaller handwriting. Learn to mend boots. Fire holds if fed every 2 hours. Rex eats twice what he used to. In early December, he found an entry in one of Avery's older books titled Wintering Well. It detailed how to weave a blanket from strips of cloth, how to dry herbs for tea, and, most importantly, how to keep the spirit awake when the world sleeps. Ethan took those words to heart. Using the old cloth from Margaret, he tried to sew his first coat for Rex. The seams were uneven, the stitches clumsy, but Rex tolerated the fitting like a soldier, sitting still as Ethan muttered apologies and worked the thread through. When it was done, the coat hung awkwardly but kept the dog warm. Rex tested it by running outside into the flurrying snow, circling back with a bark that felt almost like laughter. Food became another challenge. Hunting was scarce. Traps caught only snow at first. But perseverance brought lessons. Ethan learned where rabbits nested, how to read tracks hidden beneath ice. He roasted what little he caught over the stove and stored dried meat in small jars sealed with wax. Each small success was celebrated with Rex by the fire. Ethan with a grin, Rex with a thump of his tail. One afternoon, while gathering firewood, Ethan saw movement among the trees. A man approaching slowly, his figure hunched and heavy. Rex barked once, low and uncertain. The stranger raised a hand in peace. As he stepped into the clearing, Ethan saw he was in his late 40s, tall but bent at one shoulder as if burdened by old injury. His beard was coarse with gray, his skin tanned to the color of walnut, and his coat patched with mismatched leather. His name, he introduced with a rasp, was Caleb Turner. Caleb explained he was a trapper, one of the few who still roamed the upper ridges. His face bore the kind of wear that didn't just come from weather, the hollow eyes of someone who had lost too much too soon. Later, Ethan would learn that Caleb had once had a wife and son in Bozeman, both taken by a fire that consumed their small cabin 6 winters ago. Since then, he had drifted, keeping mostly to the wild where the silence matched his own. "I saw your smoke," Caleb said, nodding toward the cabin. "Didn't think anyone stayed up here come winter." His voice was gravelly but not unkind. Ethan, cautious but curious, offered him shelter for the night. Inside, Caleb's presence filled the space with a mix of warmth and gravity. He moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, and when Rex sniffed him warily, the man simply said, "You're a good one, aren't you?" The dog, after a long pause, accepted the compliment and lay back down. Over supper, they spoke little at first. Caleb watched the flames, eyes distant. "This cabin," he murmured, "used to belong to Thomas Avery, didn't it?" Ethan nodded, surprised. Caleb smiled faintly. "Met him once, years ago. He fixed me a broken axe handle without saying more than 10 words. Good man. Quiet kind. This place saved him, I think." They sat together until late. Before leaving the next morning, Caleb handed Ethan a small, worn sharpening stone. "Keep your edges true," he said, "and the rest will follow." Then he disappeared into the woods, leaving behind footprints that the snow soon erased. The rest of winter unfolded in long, gentle tests. Ethan battled sickness once, a fever that lasted 3 days. Rex stayed pressed against him the entire time, refusing to eat until Ethan did. When the fever broke, the boy wept, not from pain, but from the sheer tenderness of loyalty. He carved Rex's likeness into a piece of pine, clumsy but heartfelt, and placed it on the mantel beside Avery's old lantern. By February, the storms began to ease. The snow thinned to glassy crusts, and sunlight sometimes lingered past 5. Ethan had grown stronger, his shoulders broader, his hands scarred and sure. He could build, hunt, repair, cook, and listen, to wind, to silence, to himself. The day the first rivulets of meltwater trickled down from the ridge, he stepped outside and breathed in deeply. The cabin behind him no longer felt borrowed. It was his home now, not because he owned it, but because he had earned it. Rex bounded ahead through the wet snow, barking toward the valley where the world waited. The mountain air was still sharp, but in it was the scent of something new, spring, or perhaps simply hope. Ethan turned back once to look at the smoke curling from the chimney and smiled. He whispered to the memory of Thomas Avery, "I think I understand now." And somewhere in that wind, or maybe only in his heart, he felt the silence answer. 3 years passed as quietly as snow melting in spring. The cabin, once fragile and forgotten, now stood proud against the slope, its timbers darkened to the color of rich coffee, its chimney breathing steady ribbons of smoke each morning. The forest around it had changed too. Ethan had cleared a garden on the south side where he grew potatoes, beans, and hardy herbs. A small fence kept deer from stealing the shoots. The stream nearby, once choked with leaves, now ran clear, diverted by a narrow trench he had built with his own hands to bring fresh water to the cabin's edge. The boy who once stumbled over roots had grown into a young man who moved through the woods as if he belonged there. At 16, Ethan Miller was tall, broad across the shoulders but still lean, his hands marked with the small scars of craft. His face had sharpened, the softness of childhood replaced by quiet purpose. His hair had darkened slightly from sun and weather. His eyes, the same glacial blue, carried a depth that came from solitude and effort rather than years. He had the look of someone older than his age, a kind of calm born from living close to silence. Rex, now fully mature at 5 years old, was a magnificent animal. His coat gleamed with health, thick and dense, a perfect saddle of black and gold. His muzzle had just begun to silver around the edges, lending him a dignified air. His energy was boundless. He followed Ethan everywhere, guarding the garden, fetching tools, sleeping near the forge Ethan had built at the edge of the clearing. Their bond was wordless yet absolute. They understood each other's moods like reflections on still water. That forge had become Ethan's greatest pride. Using stones scavenged from the riverbed and clay mixed with ash, he had built a small furnace capable of holding heat long enough to shape metal. It started as an experiment. Caleb Turner's sharpening stone had inspired him, but soon became a calling. He scavenged broken tools, melted them down, and reshaped them into knives, some hinges, hooks, and once, even a shovel blade. His craftsmanship grew with each mistake, his patience refined by failure. One late summer afternoon, while tempering a blade in the coals, Ethan heard a faint call from the trees below. Rex barked once, tail stiff. A moment later, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, a young woman leading a horse burdened with supplies. She wore a long duster coat of tan canvas, the hem stained with mud, and a wool scarf wrapped around her neck. Her name, she introduced when she saw Ethan's cautious stare, was Clara Reeves. Clara was 17, tall and slender but strong, her posture that of someone used to long rides and harder days. Her hair was the color of wheat left in sunlight too long, tied back in a loose braid. Freckles crossed her nose and cheeks, and though her expression was guarded, her eyes, deep hazel, bright with intelligence, spoke of someone observant, careful with words but quick with thought. She had come, she said, from the valley to the east, from a small settlement called Red Hollow. Her father had died the year before, leaving her to manage a failing homestead alone. She'd heard, through Margaret Hill, of a young craftsman who could mend anything. Ethan, surprised and slightly shy, nodded toward the forge. "I can try," he said simply. She smiled, just barely, and lifted a broken iron plow blade from her pack. "Try's good enough." They worked together in near silence. The clang of hammer on metal filled the afternoon air, sharp and rhythmic. Clara watched as Ethan heated the blade until it glowed orange, then struck it in measured blows, his movements sure, efficient, almost graceful. When the repair was done, she ran a hand along the seam, impressed. "You've got a steady hand for someone your age," she said. Ethan shrugged, a little embarrassed. "The mountain teaches you that. Make one wrong hit, and it remembers." Clara laughed softly, a sound that startled Rex enough to wag his tail uncertainly. She stayed for supper, a stew of rabbit, wild herbs, and potatoes, and listened as Ethan talked about the journals of Thomas Avery and how they had guided his life. In return, she spoke of Red Hollow, a place struggling against drought, where people were leaving one by one. Her mother had been sick, she explained, and she'd taken on everything: the fields, the animals, the debts. "I don't want to give up," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the fire. "But I can't keep patching what keeps breaking." Ethan understood that kind of stubborn hope. Before dawn, he loaded the repaired plow onto her horse and handed her a small knife he'd forged as a gift. The handle was carved from pine, polished smooth. "For the road," he said. She accepted it with a nod, and though she didn't say much more, something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of two young lives shaped by endurance. Over the months that followed, Clara returned several times, bringing broken tools or trade goods from Red Hollow: salt, seeds, a tin kettle. Each visit was brief, practical, yet slowly, their conversations deepened. She teased him about the smoke stains on his hands. He learned she was an excellent rider and once dreamed of studying medicine before the drought took that future away. Rex grew fond of her, greeting her with soft whines and circling her horse until she laughed. That winter, Ethan began rewriting Thomas Avery's journals. He spent evenings at the table, copying the old entries in neater handwriting, adding his own discoveries: how to forge tools in cold air, how to dry clay for waterproofing, how to make a garden bloom early by lining beds with dark stones. He bound each finished notebook with twine and stacked them carefully in a wooden chest he had built himself. When spring returned, Clara arrived again with news. Red Hollow was nearly empty now. Her mother had passed, and she planned to leave the valley altogether, maybe head north where the rivers still ran deep. She looked around the cabin, the garden, the forge, the little world Ethan had built, and said, half joking but not really, "You made this place feel alive again. Maybe you should write a book." Ethan smiled faintly. "Someone already did. I'm just finishing his." Before she left, she tied a red ribbon to one of the porch beams. "So I can find it again someday," she said. Rex barked as she mounted her horse, and for a long time after she disappeared down the trail, Ethan stood at the doorway, the ribbon fluttering gently in the mountain wind. That night, he sat by the fire, the journals stacked beside him, the forge cooling outside. The cabin glowed with the warmth of its labor and memory. He realized he had become what Thomas Avery once was: a maker, a keeper, a bridge between solitude and creation. And in that quiet awareness, Ethan smiled, his hand resting on Rex's back, knowing the mountain had shaped him into something worth leaving behind. The mountain woke early that summer, wrapped in gold mist and birdsong. Sunlight filtered through the pines, spilling over the roof of the cabin that had stood weather and time like an old sentinel. Ethan Miller sat at the table inside, a man now of 19, taller, stronger, his face chiseled by wind and labor. His hair was longer, brushing his collar, and faint stubble shadowed his jaw, a quiet mark of the years that had passed since he first crossed the valley as a boy. Before him lay the final journal, its leather still soft from his careful handling. He had rewritten every page of Thomas Avery's legacy, adding his own lines between the margins. Now he traced his name across the inside cover and closed it gently. Rex lay near the doorway, his muzzle white with age but his eyes as sharp and loyal as ever. At 8 years old, he had grown slower, preferring to rest by the fire or watch the forest through half-lidded eyes. Yet whenever Ethan rose, Rex's ears would twitch, his tail tapping once, twice, as if to say, "I'm still here." That morning, when Ethan stood, the dog followed him outside, trotting with measured patience down the worn steps that Ethan himself had built years ago. The forest greeted them with a whisper of leaves and the smell of resin. The garden still bloomed, though untamed now, wildflowers mixing with herbs and rows of potatoes gone to seed. Ethan looked over it all, the cabin, the clearing, the forge beside the stream, and felt a stillness deeper than pride. He had built, learned, endured, and healed, but something in his chest told him it was time to move on. He spent the day tending to small things, tightening the shutters, oiling the hinges, stacking the remaining wood beneath the porch. He cleaned the forge, left a bundle of dry kindling inside the stove, and placed a small jar of honey from last season on the table beside the journals. By afternoon, the air had grown warm, and cicadas sang from the trees. A soft knock startled him. Few people ever came this far now. When he opened the door, a figure stood in the sunlight. A young man, no older than 16, thin and freckled, wearing a pack nearly as large as himself. His clothes were dusty, and his boots looked borrowed, too big for his feet. His name, he said, was Lucas Bennett. Lucas had come from the town of Emigrant, 2 valleys east, though it had taken him days to find the path. He was quiet at first, hesitant, his voice the cracked edge of exhaustion. His hair was dark chestnut, falling across a face that might have been handsome if not for the shadows under his eyes. He carried a wooden box strapped to his pack, its lid carved with initials, CB. When Ethan asked, Lucas looked away before answering. "It belonged to my mother," he said simply. The boy's story came in fragments over supper. His mother, Clara Bennett, had died that spring after a long illness. She had been born Clara Reeves, once a girl from Red Hollow who had known this mountain long ago. At her passing, she left him the carved box and a letter containing a map, one that led to the cabin of Thomas Avery and the man who fixed things. Ethan listened without speaking, a stillness settling over him that felt almost divine. He remembered Clara's hazel eyes, the laughter that had once echoed through this same clearing. For a long moment, the two of them sat in silence, the fire snapping softly. Lucas shifted uneasily. "She told me that whoever lives here knows how to start again. I thought maybe—" His voice broke, then steadied. "Maybe I could learn too." Ethan studied him, the awkward way he sat, the restless twitch in his hands, the fear hidden under defiance. He saw himself years ago, lost and curious, walking into this same place with only a dog and a hunger to belong. He smiled faintly. "You found it," he said. "That's the hardest part." Rex rose slowly, padded toward the boy, and sniffed his hands. The dog's tail gave one slow wag, approval earned. Lucas grinned through the blur of tears that came unbidden. "He likes me," he said. Ethan nodded. "He doesn't like just anyone." That night, Lucas slept on the cot near the window, while Ethan sat at the table writing by lamplight. He took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote carefully, his handwriting sure and calm. Ethan Miller, the second keeper of the mountain cabin. May whoever finds this place after me learn not just to survive, but to live with quiet courage. He placed the note atop the journals, weighed it down with the same pocket knife he'd once made for Clara. By morning, the decision was clear. He left before dawn, the forest still pale with mist. Rex followed him to the ridge, panting but determined, until the climb became too steep. Ethan knelt, wrapped his arms around the old shepherd, and whispered something only the wind would hear. Rex pressed his muzzle against Ethan's chest and gave a soft, throaty bark, the sound of farewell. When Ethan turned down the trail, the dog remained, a gray sentinel framed by the sunrise. By the time Ethan looked back one last time, Rex had lain down in the grass, still watching, tail curled around his paws. Hours later, Lucas woke to birdsong and a shaft of light through the window. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine. On the table lay the letter and journals, beside a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and a tin cup of honey. He unfolded the note, read it once, then twice, his throat tight. Outside, the mountain whispered in the same slow rhythm it always had. Lucas spent the day exploring every corner, touching the tools, the forge, the shelves lined with careful writing. He found a small carving on the mantel, a likeness of a dog with one ear cocked. He smiled and placed his mother's wooden box beside it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, he opened the first journal. The handwriting began with Thomas Avery's, neat and steady, then shifted to Ethan's, sharper, surer. At the bottom of the first page, Ethan had written, "If you are reading this, it means the world decided to keep going. That's reason enough to begin." Lucas read until the shadows swallowed the room. The firelight flickered across his face, softening its tired lines. When he finally looked up, the cabin felt less strange, less empty. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint echo of a bark, a laugh, maybe both. The mountain, eternal as faith, had found its next keeper. When the last page turns and the fire in the mountain cabin fades to embers, one truth remains. Sometimes, what we call a coincidence is simply God's quiet way of working miracles. The cabin was never just wood and stone. It was a place of grace, where lost souls found direction, where pain became patience, and where loneliness turned into peace. Maybe it wasn't Thomas Avery who built it. Maybe it wasn't even Ethan who carried on the legacy. Maybe it was God himself, using their hands, their choices, and their courage to remind us that healing doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it comes in silence, in learning, in trying again. And perhaps that's the real miracle, that when we stop running and start listening, we find the cabin waiting for us somewhere in our own lives, in a small act of kindness, a moment of forgiveness, or a single step toward rebuilding what was broken. So if this story touched you, share it. Let it find another soul who might be wandering, another heart that needs to know it's never too late to begin again. Leave a comment about what the cabin means to you. Is it faith, family, or the strength to start over? Subscribe if you believe stories like this remind the world that light still exists, even in the fog. And as you go back to your day, may you carry this blessing with you. May God guide your steps when the path is hidden, warm your heart when the world feels cold, and lead you, always, to your own cabin of peace. God bless you, and may His grace follow you wherever you go.